So that is a basic introduction to the anatomy, and we'll just spend some time kind of going over that and just reiterating that. So just kind of a bit of repetition here. So looking at the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons originate in the thoracolumbar spinal cord. So T1 all the way down to L2, they're coming specifically from the lateral horn of the spinal cord, and sometimes the intermediolateral cell column, okay? Very small extension. And in some texts, you actually see that the lateral horn is synonymous with the intermediolateral cell column. So kind of the same general region of the spinal cord. The general anatomy here is that there's a short preganglionic neuron to the sympathetic chain, usually to that autonomic ganglia. Then there is a long postganglionic neuron from the ganglia out to the effector organ or the effector tissue. Okay, and then we see that the ganglia here are linked together. So again, because they're in such close proximity, they are linked together to form the sympathetic chain. So this structure that is adjacent to the spinal cord, which is nothing but a collection of these autonomic ganglia. The second route for communication. So as we mentioned earlier, there are three options for communication of the sympathetic signals. The second of those options is a collateral ganglia. So this is a ganglia that is not a part of the sympathetic chain. And if we go back here, we can see that some of these synapses are happening within the sympathetic chain. But if we look at these synapses right here, these are not a part of the sympathetic chain. These are known as collateral ganglia, okay? So any type of synapse that is happening within the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic division, that is not happening as a part of the chain is called a collateral ganglia, all right? And that is the second route of communication of the sympathetic nervous system. And then the third and final route is the adrenal medulla gland. So the adrenal medulla, which is the central part of the adrenal gland, and just to kind of backtrack and give some context here, the adrenal glands are the paired glands that are located above the kidneys, right? So left and right kidneys has this gland located at the top of it, which we can see here. And if we were to cut that gland in half, we would see two distinct regions. We would see the outer sort of light staining region or light appearing region that's called the cortex. And then we would see the inner darker staining or darker appearing region that is called the medulla. Within that medulla, we have some cells that are called chromophant cells. And the chromophant cells are essentially modified sympathetic postganglionic cells. So they are going to behave just like a postganglionic neuron. Okay, I'll say that again. So the chromophant cells that are located within the adrenal medulla are essentially modified postganglionic neurons or postganglionic cells in that they are going to behave just like a postganglionic neuron anywhere else in the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, they are going to release norepinephrine, about 20%, epinephrine, most of its secretion, so about 80%, and then a very small amount of dopamine. Okay, and so the only difference between the sympathetic neurons, right, the postganglionic sympathetic neurons, and these cells is that they can release their secretions into the blood. And whenever we release a neurotransmitter into the blood, it becomes a hormone. So the only difference between epinephrine as a hormone and epinephrine as a neurotransmitter is the route of secretion. So when these chromophant cells release epinephrine into the blood, we call that a hormone. But if we had one of these postganglionic cells release that epinephrine at a synapse, that would be called a neurotransmitter, all right? And so just to reiterate, this is the third route of communication. And this is what allows the sympathetic nervous system to be so quick in its response, to have such a nimble response. So if I'm walking in the woods and I'm hiking and I see a bear or a lion or a tiger or whatever, and I immediately stop in my tracks, I want this response to be very rapid. I want things to be moving very quickly. And so within the sympathetic nervous system, there is this access where these neurotransmitters can be released into the blood, and they can flood the vascular system and send this signal to all of these glands and muscles and structures very, very quickly because of this third route of communication. Okay, So when we dump that epinephrine into the blood, it's going to go to the heart very quickly, to the brain very quickly, to our blood vessels very quickly, to our muscles very quickly. And this is what allows the sympathetic response to be a very rapid response when compared to the parasympathetic system that only uses the neuron to neuron and the neurotransmitter route of communication. Alrighty. Okay. So here is what those three routes of communication look like. So we've got fibers coming from T1 to L2 of the lateral horn of the spinal cord. And then the first route is going to be synapsing onto a ganglia that is a part of the sympathetic chain. So an autonomic ganglia that is within the sympathetic chain, and then out to an effector organ. We also have a collateral ganglia that is not a part of the sympathetic chain, and then out to the effector organ. And as we can see, these two routes of communication, so the sympathetic chain and the collateral ganglia, are kind of one-to-one communication. So one neuron to another neuron, then to the organ, right? So kind of that local, slower route of communication. And so the third route of communication is how we can have that speed up, how we can have an expedited response. We go from the spinal cord out to that chromophant cell, which is pretty much acting like a postganglionic neuron. And then that cell will dump its secretions into the blood, and that can go very rapidly throughout the entire system and hit many, many different effector organs at the same time. Okay. And so the chromophant cell here is just behaving in the very same way that these postganglionic fibers would. It is just using a more rapid route of communication by dumping these hormones into the blood instead. In fact, many scientists have taken these chromophant cells and they have put them in the appropriate medium, and they have actually begun to grow axons. So the origin of these chromophant cells is coming from the same origin that our nervous tissue comes from. It is just shaped like a cell, but it is behaving just like a neuron. Alrighty? Okay. Any questions so far? So I think we're gonna pause here and see what questions we have. Okay, now if we're looking at the anatomy of the sympathetic nervous system, we see that the preganglionic fiber arises from the lateral horn here. It's then going to use the ventral root, right? The ventral root to exit the spinal cord and make its way into the spinal nerve. And so when it's doing that, it's going to be considered a white ramus fiber, right? It's going to be myelinated and it's going to be a white ramus fiber. When it synapses onto the ganglia, it's then going to rejoin or re-emerge into the spinal nerve. And in that instance, it will be considered a gray ramus fiber, okay? Remember, the difference between white ramus and gray ramus is the presence of myelination. White ramus fibers are myelinated, gray ramus fibers are not myelinated. And so that is the main difference between the preganglionic fiber, which is coming from spinal cord, to the ganglia. That is a white ramus or a myelinated fiber, shown here in light blue. And then the postganglionic fiber, which is leaving the ganglia, the dark blue structure here, going from that ganglia to the effector organ, is going to be a gray ramus fiber, which is unmyelinated. Okay.